now. But I just want to welcome you all to our first event of the spring semester. We're, back on Zoom for people's ease. We might have a couple of events in person in the spring months. The HSS Expo, for instance, that's at the end of April, will hopefully be in person on the quad and in, the halls, maybe even. I know Professor Napoli wants to sort of fill the halls with photographs. So stay tuned for those announcements. But until then, the event schedule for the coming semester is a link I will put on the chat or in the chat. And JC, I will also put the recording link or the YouTube channel link in the chat so you can know where to go for this talk and all other talks that we've recorded over the years. So without further ado, Professor Johnson's also going to post it all over the social media threads. So there's lots of places you can access us. But without further ado, we have two of our own professors here, Professor Warren and Professor Rawson, who are going to talk about their new books. Professor Rawson's came out in the fall and Professor Warren's is imminent. It's almost in the presses. So you guys can hear about the process of their books and also get a chance to hear not only about the content, but to hear two historians who are writing things that are similar but also different, talk to each other about their similar and also different processes and things when they're doing this kind of work. So Professor Rawson and Professor Warren sent me a bunch of questions. I will ask them these questions to get the ball rolling. But if you have questions that you would like to ask, there's certainly a Q&A part of this event, but also feel free to pop questions in the chat, send them to me, put them in the chat thread so everyone can see them, and then we can sort of integrate them into the whole conversation and certainly into the Q&A. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Warren. No, to Professor Rawson. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mancia. My new book is entitled The Nature of Tomorrow, A History of the Environmental Future, and it just came out this past November through Yale University Press. This is a history of past visions of the environmental future. So I explore those visions as they've appeared in Western culture from about 1600 to present. Now, historians have studied past futures before, but they haven't done it really from an environmental perspective. They've tended to focus on the sort of glittering technologies that often define for us what the future is supposed to look like. Think flying cars and domed cities, rocket ships and stuff like that. But to my mind, all of those advances are really about developing more control over the natural world. So what the book tries to do is to peek behind that technological curtain and to reread these past visions through an environmental lens rather than a technological one. So to get at these environmental visions, I look at a mixture of fiction and nonfiction sources, sources that have tried to imagine what the future will someday be like. And the sources include a very wide variety of things, things like Francis Bacon's famous utopia, The New Atlantis, which was published all the way back in 1626, the science fiction novels of Jules Verne, which are from the 19th century and the early 20th, the cartoon The Jetsons, there's a little analysis of that, think tank forecasts, government projections, all kinds of different things, anything where someone was trying to paint a comprehensive picture of the world of tomorrow. Now, from those sources, I try to assemble portraits of the kinds of environmental futures that the Western world has been anticipating over the last 400 years. And I also try to explain how those visions first emerged and how they evolved over time. There is, of course, a lot of diversity in these various visions of tomorrow. But I did find that there's sort of a single environmental expectation that unites them from an early date and really continues to do so today. And it's the expectation that humankind will expand endlessly across the globe, no matter the environmental consequences. It's an expectation of endless growth. That expectation has produced two competing stories about the future that I really focus on in the book. They're probably stories that most of you, I think, will be familiar with. The first one imagines endless growth leading to the complete development of the Earth, the eventual conquest of the stars. The result is usually a technological utopia of some sort, usually a utopia of endless abundance. It's worth noting that there are dystopian versions of this story as well, where technologies actually make our lives worse instead, but they're usually visions of endless abundance. The other vision sees endless growth leading to an environmental catastrophe of some kind and a dystopian future. And that one, of course, very much hits home at the present historical moment, because that has sort of become the baseline for us, very much so in fiction. You'd be hard pressed to find a work of science fiction right now that does not take some kind of environmental catastrophe as the baseline of what the future will entail. Most visions of the environmental future over the past couple of hundred years tend to fall into one of these two narratives. But if you think about it, there's sort of an obvious imaginative gap here. Where are the visions of the future that ask the question, should we keep growing? Right? Where are the visions that suggest futures where we actually learn to live within our environmental means? Well, those visions have appeared at times, usually in particular historical moments, but they have been comparatively rare. And I argue in the book, that all of this stuff is important because these kinds of stories carry causative weight. They matter. They structure our goals, they structure our actions as a society, and we could say they serve as maps of the sort for our civilization. And I would argue that we're never going to find our way out of our current environmental problems and achieve a sustainable society if our dreams of the future are fixated on achieving endless growth on a finite planet. To me, that represents really a dramatic failure of imagination. And I think that failure of imagination lies right at the root of our contemporary environmental crisis. So toward the end of the book, I try to bring in the important role that I think history can play in solving our environmental problems. Futurists, people who sort of focus on predicting what the world of tomorrow will be like. Some of these are professional futurists, but futurists know that our visions of tomorrow tend to grow out of our interpretations of the past. The two are very much linked in really interesting ways. And our current visions of tomorrow are built on histories that tend to celebrate human expansion as an unqualified triumph. So the book ends with a call for new histories that move beyond that triumphal narrative. Only then, I argue, can we actually create new stories about the future, stories that might be able to serve as new kinds of maps to really a truly sustainable civilization. And there's more, of course, but that's sort of the basic idea. So I'll stop there and turn the lectern over to my colleague.
Oh boy. I got to tell you, Mike's book there's so many sympathies, especially with the book I'm going to be working on next, where the home of the future is a big part of the early chapters, because there is this vision of a very different inward-looking vision of a future that's technologically based. Anyway, enough about the future. Let's talk about rickets. So my book is called Starved for Light, How Rickets and Vitamin D Deficiency Shaped Modern America. And I really got interested this about 20 years ago, actually, when it looked like the ancient scourge of rickets was staging a comeback in the United States. Back then, reports in medical journals described symptoms in children that harkened back to nightmarish chapters in pediatric textbooks from a century earlier. Here's a refresher. if you have forgotten. Uh, rickets is a deficiency disease, and it's most frequently a deficiency in either vitamin D or calcium. Most frequently, it's associated with vitamin D deficiency because calcium, frankly, is so easy to get in the diet sufficiently. Now, in pronounced cases of rickets, a child's bones become soft, and that produces symptoms such as an enlarged skull, bowed legs, the flaring of wrist bones, and even the twisting of the spine. Now, these cases a generation ago were rare, but national surveys were showing that rickets was indeed on the rise in the United States. For many at the time, for most people, this was a huge surprise because there was this broadly accepted truth, in scare quotes, that universal vitamin D supplementation in milk and other food products had completely vanquished rickets decades before. So for me, the return of rickets raised a bumper crop of the kinds of ironies and conflicts that we historians live for. Here we are in America, the fattest nation in the world, facing the resurgence of a disease of malnutrition. But the story of rickets isn't just about bent bones. These early reports fed into a growing concern over vitamin D deficiency in the general population. And then, as now, the number of prescriptions doctors giving for blood tests to test how much vitamin D we have, those tests are skyrocketing, as is the demand for vitamin D supplementation. More and more products on the grocery store proclaim that they're fortified with the sunshine vitamin. And vitamin D has taken center stage in a growing health debate over modern Americans spending too little time out of doors or in the sunlight, which is a big topic for my next book. But now, as throughout the last century, the most common solution was not more sunshine, but a biomedical fix to take your sunshine in a manufactured supplement. Now, as with my previous book on lead poisoning, this book embraces its subject ancient history as well as its contemporary impact. So I look at the role of sun and skin and bone in shaping human evolution, and I trace the medical understanding of rickets from the ancient world well into the first published European accounts that appeared in the 17th century. But I focus on the 19th and 20th centuries when industrialization, urban growth, and global migration inverted what had been the pre-modern understanding of rickets as a disease of wealthy children, where in the darkening cities of Europe's industrial revolution, rickets was clearly falling heaviest upon the children of the poor, bending their bodies, shortening their lives. And so in Europe, economic class was seen as the defining variable in terms of who was going to get rickets. In the US, on the other hand, race was squarely the focus. 19th century popular, I can make it clear, 19th century popular literature showed clear evidence that rickets affected wealthy and poor Americans, black and white, north and south. Nonetheless, in our slave economy, rickets and race dominated the conversation. Rickets' effect on African and African American children was undeniable. It bowed their legs, deformed their pelvises, which was an obstetrical time bomb. It sapped their strength and degraded their immunity to infection. And for cultural purposes, it marked African Americans in the eyes of slaveholders as a, quote, tropical race, better adapted than European Americans for hard labor in the heat of the South, and doomed to extinction should they attempt to move to northern climates. Now, things got worse in America at the end of the 1800s as America's urbanization and industrialization produced conditions here as unhealthy as anything found in Dickensian England. American medicine turned its attention to rickets among urban immigrants, both African Americans and Southern Europeans, And while some concluded that rickets in these populations was symptomatic of, quote, the physical deterioration of a southern race in a northern climate, others saw economic, environmental, and cultural causes. And they sought societal, diet-based solutions. So that's where my book's central story comes. It's relating the dramatic and comparatively sudden change in how modern Americans get their vitamin D. The search for the rickets cause and its cure pointed out huge gaps in knowledge about basic biochemistry and physiology. But by the 1920s, scientists had identified vitamin D, confirmed the curative power of the traditional remedy of cod liver oil. I have a whole chapter on cod liver oil. They discovered how to produce vitamin D in the laboratory and subsequently in the factory. And they tested their new elixir in benign community studies, but also in ghoulish clinical experiments on young children, placing them in darkened hospital wards and withholding all sources of vitamin D, causing them to develop rickets in order to test the doctor's new cure. The new science of rickets was the basis of our modern solution, which was allegedly universal supplementation of dairy products with vitamin D. So my story has a reasonably clear narrative with a beginning, a middle, and if not a clear end, then at least it's a unique present in which vitamin D is a commodity we consume to mitigate at least some of the effects of our unhealthy environments. But I argue in the last chapter, it seems like science and industry has supplanted the sun. So I turn things back over to Lauren.
Awesome. Well, these are some pretty fascinating topics. How did you guys come upon these topics? You know, Professor Warren, were you just shopping in the grocery store and seeing vitamin D, vitamin D? You know, what inspired you guys to approach these topics? And also, were they, as you've articulated them here, was this the topic you started out to investigate? How did the topic transform over the course of writing the book?
Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, topics can come from anywhere. I suppose on its deepest level, this book probably grew out of my lifelong personal interest in science fiction, and then my scholarly interest in how people think about nature. But you know, your comment that your question about whether Professor Warren might have seen something on a supermarket shelf reminded me that one of my inspirations came a long time ago when my daughter came home from elementary school with a Time magazine for kids that they gave them in class. And it was a special environmental issue. And when you opened it up, there was a 2-page spread of the environmental city of the future. And it looked exactly like you would think it looks. We all have these kinds of images in our heads. You know, the buildings had grass roofs, and there was a monorail and lots of public transportation and solar panels and all these kinds of things. But I looked at it and I thought, that's not what the city of the future looked like when I was a kid. You know, it looked like the Jetsons. It looked completely different. There wasn't all this nature stuff all around. It wasn't so green. And then I thought to myself, what happened? You know, in a generation, what explains this change? So that was a moment for me as well that sort of prompted some of the questions I was asking. But you're right too that the book you end up with is often quite different from the one you started with. That wasn't the case with my first book. That was pretty much, you know, in many ways it went according to plan. This book actually started out as a history of ecological utopias or green utopias in American thought in particular. But the themes I was pursuing kept sort of escaping across boundaries into national boundaries into other countries. and also outside of the fairly limited genre of utopias. So I actually ended up broadening the project to cover the larger Western world, and broadening the project to cover not just utopias, but the imagined future in general. So you need to go where your sources take you as well, and they might take you very different places than you thought they would.
It's pretty funny that for both Mike and me, domed cities triggered in part this research, because for me, Ricketts, which is going to be my second monograph, will always actually be my third monograph, because it was supposed to be my third monograph. It was actually it was a sub-theme in the book that I'm working on about Americans moving more and more of their time indoors. And right off the bat, as I was doing that research, Ricketts was always being portrayed a century ago as a direct consequence of spending more time in indoors and in dark cities. So the theme was always there as part of the big book. And then the more I so I thought, well, maybe I'll put a chapter about Ricketts in this book. And I started thinking about what that chapter might look like. And I finally just said, F it, it's a book. Professor Troyansky was instrumental in this, guiding me on my professional career. He decided, well, why don't you go ahead and write your third book second? It's a short little piece. There were two at the time. There were two series from university presses, with similar titles like Biography of a Disease, that looked for short monographs, 150, 250 page surveys, all based in, for the most part, synthetic work, looking at using other secondary sources. And I thought, sure, I can knock this book out in 2 years. And then the topic just got more and more interesting to me. It was going to be this narrow little thing for my peers in medical history, but the topics, especially around race, just started jumping out at me and being more and more important. So that's where I came to this massive book about Ricketts.
Awesome. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and that actually you raise the interesting topic of how long it takes to finish a book as well. It doesn't, depending on the kind of book and what the sources are and how prepared you are to do that kind of research and all kinds of other factors, it can take you much longer to write a short book than it does to write a long book. I mean, the book I just finished is not a large book, but it took just as long to research and write as my prior book did.
Well, I'll let you know when I write a short book.
Can you both talk about, I mean, you're both writing books that are both right smack dab in the middle of your wheelhouses as Americanists, but these books are also have chapters that go earlier than you've gone before, that go transnational, that maybe take up, Professor Warren, you were saying themes of race that you hadn't investigated before, maybe, I'm not sure. How do you move beyond your areas of expertise as you're writing? And, I'm sure that contributes to the length of time it takes maybe to write the book, but, how do you do that with certainty? And, many of the students might be in classes, for instance, where they're doing research in a field that they have absolutely no barometer for, right? Like, how do they do that research? How did you do it, et cetera?
Yeah, my book moves way beyond my area of expertise. It draws, I was trained as a US historian. My first book was on 19th century US urban history, environmental history as well. This one draws heavily on British and French sources, and it starts way back around 1600. I also discuss works written in Italy, Germany, and elsewhere. And this was all extraordinarily difficult. It takes a lot of time to develop enough knowledge about something to speak authoritatively about it. And there are always going to be scholars in those areas who are actual experts and can see all of the deficiencies in what you've done that you might not see. So one thing that historians often do in these cases is, as Professor Warren did, have some of those experts read their work while it's still in the manuscript stage. And Professor Troyansky, who's an expert in French history, actually was good enough to read my manuscript as well early in the process. But I think despite the extra work and the risks involved, I think there are tremendous insights to be gained by doing that kind of transnational research. So it's ultimately worth the extra effort.
Yeah, for me, this book is, I'm taking it clearly from a U.S.-centric position, but a lot of the research was done in either the UK or the United States, so that was an advantage. My actual more experience that I had with this question was in the lead book, where I had a lot of not just French and German sources, but the questions and the way this was mostly about occupational lead poisoning. The questions they were asking, the frames they were coming from were so different because of the long national histories around labor and medicine. So I needed to learn much more about those national stories than I think I needed to concern myself with in this case. As far as the language barrier, it's always, you can do quite well if most of your sources are medical sources, because you can do quite well with Google Translate and a good medical encyclopedia, because they're talking about the same things. Half the time they fall back on Greek and Latin words anyway, so it's less of a problem.
So, I mean, Chris, you just mentioned archives, and so my ears perked up only because the last couple of talks we've had, people have told stories of source discoveries, either in archives or, science fiction books you'd never heard of before or something like that. Do either of you have any fun tales from the archive or tales from the research of these books that you want to share with us? Fun discoveries, crazy words.
Well, I'll jump in and let Mike top this. Because as it turns out, so much of this work was done in pandemic times, and increasingly I was constantly shocked at what good stuff I could find working in my underwear in my home office, but when I started the project, I was working in one of the best medical history libraries in the country, and I had the keys to the kingdom, and so I have 2 or 3 years of really wonderful research that other people couldn't easily get their hands on. However, I was so tempted to just jettison that so that I could put in my acknowledgments, I want to thank Google. I want to thank all the virtual sources that I was able to use. But no, I actually do have an archival story that the shock that I found was when I came across the correspondence about some of these experiments that were being done in Children's Hospital Philadelphia. Just the casual dismissal of the humanity of these infants who were being tested, who were being locked up in, like I say, dark wards of hospitals, all vitamin D supplement withdrawn so that they would get sick. To test what? To test a known quantity, a vitamin D elixir that was just a variation on what was already proven to be effective. It was just horrible. And so, yeah, I'm glad I found it, but it was a shock to see that.
And you say it was correspondence, so it was letters between.
Oh, yeah. Correspondence between the funders of this, which is the Wisconsin Alumni Research Fund, which was sitting on this huge cache of money from the patent to create artificial vitamin D or manufactured vitamin D, and they were doling out research grants all around the country to test these things. And a lot of the tests were pretty benign, but a handful of them in a couple of different institutions were these clinical tests that were.
And do you have any? Do you have any sources from the research subjects or their families, or is it all from the clinical?
No, it's all from on high.
Wow, amazing. Professor Rawson, archival discoveries or fun time with sources.
Well, the research as a whole was a lot of fun because I basically got to lie around for a number of years and read old science fiction, and what's not fun about that? And look at through pictures and books filled with illustrations of futuristic railroad trains and rocket ships and space colonies and whatnot. It was a little bit like getting to be 12 years old again. I got to reread all the H.G. Wells stories that I hadn't read since I was a kid and whatnot. So a lot of it was a lot of fun. I guess I was surprised. I was surprised by how boring early 19th century science fiction can be. I just can't imagine that anybody would want to read that. It's just because the language is very different, and the pacing is different and all. But that could be kind of painful to get through. But there was a lot of gold in there, and I had to take my time to sift it out. But I think I was also surprised by how prominent this theme of growth was in the documents, because it's not what I went looking for originally. I was looking for stories about a green future and an environmentally sustainable future, and those stories were so the exception to the rule that sort of took me aback, and it took me a little while to reorient the questions I was asking and sort of go back and almost start again, asking a different set of questions.
I want to pile on there for looking through certain pages of Mike's book, looking in the footnote pages, just the sources just hit me. Man, I got to find something that'll let me read this stuff. It's really amazing to read through the notes.
So would you consider, I mean, these sort of different sources, right, using literature, right, does that make you a cultural historian automatically? I mean, both of you are using, sources that are not, I don't know, the legislation from, governments or sort of king's edicts or whatever, right, typical historical sources, right? Does this mean that you consider yourselves with these projects cultural historians? And does spending time with these kinds of cultural products cause you to question how culture is formed, right? Do you see these sources as evidence that culture then shapes material conditions, or do you see material conditions, the contextual conditions, shaping the cultural sources you're looking at?
Well, you can't just call yourself a cultural historian, Professor Mancy. You have to pay the dues, there's membership fees, there's all that kind of stuff. That's just to start out.
Yeah, I remember a job talk where my lead book was called A Social History of Lead Poisoning, and I had a couple of times where questions from the faculty were, why is it you consider yourself a social historian? This is really cultural history, don't you understand? Okay, yeah. Whatever you call me, I'll take it.
Can you explain that though, Professor Warren, a little bit? Like, what would the conflict be there? Just for the students, right? What's the difference?
I don't think there was a conflict. Actually, I think it was, I was using a term that had been more fashionable 10 years earlier. And what I was doing, I was trained by social historians, so I thought of myself as a social historian. But I know where they were coming from, and I clearly know where it's coming from here. And your question about what comes first, culture or physical conditions, I saw that question. I said, well, how the hell am I going to answer that around rickets, which is a disease so clearly caused by material conditions that are created by culture. So we choose to do, and that's we choose to make the cities we build, and then those cities make us sick. We choose to build, but sorry, that's the kind of preface. But then we get to define that sickness as culture. We get to define who we are and how we live and what diseases we have based on, well, the norm that we have created in our built environment. So, yeah, it's ask an historian a question like that, and they're definitely going to answer that. You know, give us an either or question. We're going to say yes. The answer is yes.
Yeah, but my book is far more cultural than it is material. But I always try to be aware of the cultural historian Warren Sussman's admonishment. He said that all good history is dialectical history, and I don't know if that's actually true or not. It sounds really good, and I think it is a useful way to think about the past. But I've often thought that the dialectic between the material and the cultural can be particularly instructive when we're writing environmental history, because there's if you're talking about nature, there's so much of it that we hold in our heads, but there's also a physical reality. You know, there is a tree there that you can ride your bike into. But what you think about that tree when you look at it, whether you think it's you know, whether you think that that group of trees that you're looking at is a sacred grove or a great site for condos, you know, that's all in your head. That's the nature that's in our head, and the two interact all the time.
Professor Banerjee, did you have a comment on cultural history?
No, I don't have a comment on cultural history, but I want to commend my two colleagues for their two excellent monographs. But I have, I was trying to find an intersection between the two of their works, which they do. So my general question is if they have, and I have unfortunately not seen Professor Rawson's book yet. So I don't know what exactly is in the last chapter, but if two of you are both predicting a utopian future or a mixture of utopia and dystopia, that's my general curiosity out of my ignorance. But the second question is for Professor Warren, and that might verge on the social and the cultural history, but not so. But I was thinking if, you mentioned about Dickensian England, where it was written by more of the class issues, whereas when you steered your attention to US, you saw it's more of a race issue. Mm-hmm. And my question to you, for the students, for us, for myself, is if we can disassociate race from class, and if you found anything on the poor whites in different neighborhoods and states of the US.
Yeah, boy, lots of questions there. Let me just give you the kind of the late 20th century answer in the UK, which was that if you look up Ricketts in the UK now, it is largely framed racially. In post-colonial Great Britain, with all the influx of South Asians and Africans into Europe, Ricketts suddenly becomes seen as racialized as it ever was in the United States. It's seen as a problem of, and the South Asians are criticized for their non-traditional diets that's causing the rickets that they have, and their refusal to accept European supplementations. It's American 19th century racial framing around rickets recapitulating itself in the modern times. I think that answers some of what you're asking. But the other was about poor whites and poor blacks. I have, in talks that I'll be giving, I have a set of pictures. There's a very famous picture of a little black boy out on a denuded environment in North Carolina with terribly bowed legs. It's a very famous image. But there's, from the same, very same year, there's an equally compelling photograph of a little white boy in a similar environment. And that gets at a lot of what I want to talk about in the book. It was kind of frustrating for me. I thought I was going to be able to bring in a knockdown, drag-out argument about rickets in terms of some kind of actual causation, and it's not. It all becomes very, very mixed up in class, and the racial stuff becomes even less important than I thought it would be, but in more interesting ways.
Thank you.
Professor Warren, do you want to answer her other question? And then we'll turn to Professor Rawson for that
I'm
answer.
sorry.
The last chapter of your book, right? Like, what's your prognosis?
Well, the last chapter of the book is about the question of it has a very, if you read medical history, you know, one of the most famous medical history books is called No Magic Bullet, which is about syphilis and how a cure for syphilis is not a magic bullet because it's socially embedded. Well, for me, the last chapter is called No Magic Bolus, which is to say that there is no magic amount of vitamin D that we can give everybody and say everybody should get it because of those issues that I was just talking about. You know, through evolution, different population groups have different needs for vitamin D depending on the environment that they're in. So my prediction for the future is it's an unholy mess, because while some doctors are waiting for the Genome Project to give physicians an individually prescribed genetic prescription for each patient, we can't wait for that. And doctors have to deal in the here and now and balance ideas about racial predispositions and what the treatment should be. So it's a big mess, but I offer some solutions that I've read about for the clinical setting today. And it mostly means listen and look and be sensitive to the complexity of an individual's life and not just their self-identified race.
Professor Rawson, what's your future predictions?
Yeah, my book ends in a place where I suggest that you know, we want to find the solution to our environmental problems in science and technology, but that's not going to be where all the solutions lie. Solving our environmental problems is really going to require us to rethink how we live on a fundamental level, and to do that, I argue that we need new stories about the past that don't glorify growth, and that we need new stories about the future that imagine a truly sustainable society. And I think that the humanities are more likely to be useful in constructing those stories than they're often given credit for. But as for specific predictions, you know, historians are notorious for their reticence to give specific predictions. And I think the reason is probably that we're wrong just as often as everybody else is. But having said that, I'll also say that having studied the imagined future for about 10 years, I do know what's going to happen, but I can't tell you.
You could tell us, but then you'd have to kill us.
Well, I have more questions, but I do encourage you all to raise your hand if you have questions, or put questions in the chat, and I will ask them on your behalf if you. Professor Mims.
Yeah, I don't know what that thumb is doing there. Sorry about that. And if the background music is bothering me, just blend me out. I'm in New Jersey. I wanted to say, I think it's interesting with Professor Rawson that with that last point about how the liberal arts are possibly a real asset, and perhaps more important than a lot of people might realize, that coming out of English literature, and you know, people like Rob Nixon and the slow violence, you know, against the poor through, you know, environmental degradation, things like that, or even Scranton, Roy Scranton, or anyway, the former Iraq war vet who teaches now at, you know, one of the major, sort of Midwestern universities. He got his PhD at Princeton in English literature, and they've done a really interesting job, particularly the latter, Scranton, talking about how, you know, no silver bullet for sure, and that connects to what Professor Warren was saying, that technology won't be the salvation probably, but there are deep resources in literature, but also in culture at large, and historians are very well equipped to address that and excavate some of that in important ways. And I think it's really exciting to see that coming out of our department, and you know, CUNY and so forth, and history. That's very exciting to me. the last thing I would just say is that I think it was a turning point back when the New York Times Magazine 10 or whatever years ago had that article about this British environmentalist, King's, I forget the guy's name, but he was very big in sort of blocking the building of highways in England, and he's the guy who was sort of coming forward and saying that we have to step back and accept that we're really going to lose something, and I think what Professor Rawson's saying about the book as well is we have to lose some of our certainties and some of our fatalism as well. And I think it's interesting how those two kind of link together somehow and make each other sort of more sort of enduring, perhaps, as nuggets that need to somehow be cracked. And telling new stories about the past and fresh stories about the future seems a way to kind of unravel some of that and set up something better. And it's interesting thinking Kingsnorth, I think is his name, this guy, and you may have remembered the article, and really saying that we have to learn how to mourn and really face this trauma of losing the past. Losing something that we can't really turn, I should say, to new attitudes without facing up to that fact in our own lives, and as a society, it would be necessary too, presumably. So that just sort of gets me thinking about a lot of that, and I wanted to share those thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. It reminds me that I think history can be useful in another way. One of the things I hope the book will be is a compendium of some of the interesting ideas that writers have had for sustainable societies that go back into the 19th century, and you can even, they wouldn't have gone by the name sustainable at the time, but even like back in the 17th century. And we don't tend to think about them that way. And a lot of these stories are very obscure. They've been lost, but they embody some really interesting thought experiments, sort of mental social experiments, fictional experiments with how society could be rearranged in a more sustainable way. And sometimes we need to look back at those, because in some ways our imagination has become so constrained. It's sort of we're on this one-way street, and it's like we're on a highway, and that sort of represents our lifestyle, and we just keep going faster and faster and faster, and we can't see what's behind us anymore. We're not looking to the sides. We're afraid to take an exit because we're going too fast. But there's a lot of places we've been that we need to remember, because it might be possible to use some of those ideas. They might be useful.
Thank you. Professor Warren, did you want to respond, or should I move on to Robert?
No, let's move on to Robert.
Right, Robert, off you go.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much, Professor Rawson, Professor Warren, for being here. And I really wanted to ask Professor Rawson about if you see any continuity trends in, and I'll give a better explanation. Like, you mentioned how there weren't any visions of solar panels in the future until you had the advent of solar panels in our current day culture. Do you see how the connotative differences change as these different concepts emerge? Like, when global warming emerged as a concept, did you see more dystopian visions of the future than utopian versions? Or say different concepts like different technologies, would that improve the vision of the future as time advanced? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, first I would say that you do see solar power in some interesting ways back in 19th century literature about the future. And in fact, it's in the middle of the 19th century that the French and others are working on solar powered ways to produce steam power. It's just that those, that technology doesn't become the fastest and the cheapest to evolve, and fossil fuels win the day. But there you do see solar power in some of the literature at the time as well, some of the fictional literature too. But yeah, it's in the 20th century that you start to see this idea of an environmental apocalypse, which is an old idea, but it's when it really starts to gain traction. And the world wars actually have a lot to do with it, because after World War I, a lot of scientists start to sort of take their sort of ecological and natural history and biology perspectives, and everybody's looking for the origins of the war. How did this happen? And many scientists are saying, or wondering anyway, that maybe this was a battle for resources, and maybe this is what the future is going to be like as well. Maybe this was an environmental clash in ways that we're not appreciating. And you certainly get that on an even greater scale after World War II as well, particularly with the advent of the atomic bomb and the kind of environmental damage that it becomes clear that can do. So you get this tale of environmental apocalypse that sort of builds gradually until the environmental movement in the 1960s, and that's when it really reaches a tipping point. And you can sort of hear science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov, politicians like President Johnson, in the same speeches, the same paragraphs, talking about two very different futures. One that could be a technological utopia, and the other that could be an environmental disaster. But things really tip around 1970, and we've had this environmental disaster narrative as the baseline ever since. So the evolution of these stories is very much rooted in the social context and the political context, what's going on in the world. That's why the Jetsons, although you can enjoy it today, it's very much a product of its time when it was done in 1962 and 1963. No one would ever produce a cartoon quite like that today, because it's so out of step with what we actually think tomorrow is going to be like.
Great.
Just to add on to that, I mean, I hadn't really thought about that resources and war question in that way, but I remember back in the 70s and even in the 60s hearing that we had to be in Vietnam over tungsten. Tungsten and tin was these resources that we needed to be defending our right to. But I wanted to put in a call or ask Mike if I can be a participant instead of featured. You want to weigh in on the? I almost want to jokingly say you want to weigh in on last Saturday's crossword puzzle in the New York Times: Star Wars or Star Trek. But I wonder if you have anything to say about Star Trek, the Star Trek universe, coming as it does in the 1960s. It is couched in the entire idea of it is that the world has reached post-scarcity. And that the goal of getting out into space is not Elon Musk's goal of escaping the hellscape of the world, but it's to boldly go where no man has ever gone before. Anything about Roddenberry you want to say?
Sure, and I think Professor Warren and I might disagree about this. Let me say I'm a big Star Trek fan. But I think that the boldly go where no one has gone before is not as benign, environmentally benign as it might sound. I think the reason that Star Trek still works today is because Roddenberry set up a fictional universe of endless frontiers, right? So there are no resource shortages ever. It's just not possible in Star Trek. And a lot of Star Trek is about getting to the next planet so we can colonize it and develop it and then move on to another one. And when you have competition with the Romulans or the Klingons, these are colonial powers essentially that are coming into conflict with each other, right?
Yep.
We don't like to think about it that way. Captain Kirk's a great guy, but that's what's happening. And these are all, the whole galaxy is one giant endless resource frontier in Star Trek.
Sure.
And that's why it still works today, is because it's why Star Trek is so different from other science fiction that we encounter. Most science fiction now is very dark. It takes a baseline of environmental disaster in the future, but Star Trek doesn't. And I think that's one of the reasons it retains its popularity. It remains a science fiction space, if you will, where we can go and still live that dream of endless frontiers, and not worry about environmental shortages, because the galaxy's big.
Professor Karp.
I have questions for both folks. Teague's mention of The Expanse, which I watched the series and I'm actually gone back and now I'm reading the books. The Expanse is interesting to me because on the one hand, yes, it's also competition for resources in the outer planets. But James Holden, right, it comes from this collective where he has 5 parents, and that in order to get land in Montana, right, like there's this population control, right? Like it has to be like 5 parents to 1 child. That's like a deal they have to make in order to get land rights, in order to prevent Earth from becoming too populated. So Mike, in thinking about like the one solution, the one anti-growth solution, right, for the environment, one of the first things you think of, and this was the subject of a book a friend of mine from graduate school wrote, right, like is population control the only sort of anti-growth solution that you see in science fiction that you think is maybe a healthier way of looking forward? So, and to what degree, to what degree are science fiction authors like interested in Malthus and other things like that? So that's my question for you. And my question for Chris is, in our own lives, right, like what kinds of vitamin D solutions should we be looking at? Like my parents have a friend who's a dermatologist in the San Diego area, and he used to be obsessed with like putting sunscreen on his daughters to the extent that he would put it on like the parts in their hair to make sure they got like no sun at all. But like later in his career, realizing like, okay, there's a way in which like your desire to avoid skin cancer can kind of overcorrect, and realizing that that we need to have some kind of supplement from vitamin D as well. Like, I mean, should it just be that we ought to be getting more sun, or should we be looking to these medical solutions in order to make sure that we're getting enough? So both my questions are policy questions.
Yeah.
Because you guys both made the mistake of looking at the 20th and 21st century.
Right. Sorry, I was so interested in the sunscreen question because I remember putting it on my daughter's part that I lost track of the question for me. Ben, if you could just give it to me.
Sure.
Again.
No. To what degree, like, do you see population control as being a kind of more an important strain of anti-growth science fiction, right? Like, is that like, or are there other good solutions that sci-fi authors have entertained for being less obsessed with growth? I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
less focused.
I think science fiction generally has portrayed population control in a negative way, and it's sort of, there's a great book by Tom Robertson called The Malthusian Moment, where he looks in part at the optimistic approach to population control that was so prevalent in the 50s and 60s and to some extent into the 70s, and he calls that a Malthusian moment. And since then, we've seen, we often think of population control as cruel and unfair, and it's against people's rights, and it's often racist, depending on how you decide these things. And I think it's often talked about that way in policy circles, and it's certainly, I think, talked about that way mostly in science fiction as well. I think in science fiction, you see a more positive spin on the sort of the other end of that, which is consumption levels, because you can actually have a fairly high population if you have a low consumption level. If you have a high population and a high consumption level, you've got trouble. And I think most ecologists would tell you that if you're going to have all 8 billion people in the world right now live the way most of the people on this call do, it's not going to happen. We can't all have cars and air conditioners and houses, even for 8 billion people, and the population still rising. So it's not just about population; it's about consumption as well. And you would think it would be an easier part of the problem to work on, but people don't like to consume less either. Mm-hmm. So
less consumption for thee, but not me, is the global problem there. As to your simple question, that I have in the research that I've done. And actually, some of this comes out of the, there's been an explosion of research about the role of vitamin D in preventing or mitigating COVID. And the best research seems to be confirming what a lot of the research had been, the kind of unpartisan research. And there is partisanship in vitamin D research. I hesitate to admit that. But this kind of general rule is that a very low vitamin, real low vitamin D, if you have a very low level of vitamin D, you are at greater risk of all sorts of things. But the level of vitamin D that you need to have sufficient vitamin D is pretty easy for most people to get, even with a very safe sun exposure. So there's a whole, Australia has been going through this craziness about, about smart sun exposure. And they're getting wiser about it. But, going out and stripping down in the sun in the morning or in the evening is great. Maybe don't do it at noon. Especially if you have a family predisposition to skin cancer. If you don't and you know it, then you can relax more about it. So you see what I'm doing here? It's complicated. It depends on your family history, it depends on your geography, it depends on the climate, all of this. If you can find ways of healthily relaxing about it, that's healthy, and making sure that you are getting the vitamin D that your body can actually process and benefit from. So my final line is talk to your physician.
Awesome. Are there any more questions from the students? If no, I have one, but my question is that I believe that both of you have over the years taught courses in the department as you were writing the books. The courses might not have aligned to a T, to a chapter with what you wrote, right? But you've been teaching and thinking at the same time. And I'm just interested in any experiences you might have had in teaching with Brooklyn students, moments when the students, being of a different generation or a different culture, right, gave you a perspective on your work that you hadn't thought of before, or introduced you to a book that you hadn't known about, or a concept, or experience with vitamin D, or whatever.
Well,
Yeah, a lot of, well, on my syllabus, I have, I teach a course called The History of the Future, and an undergraduate course. And the final project is a research paper on some aspect of past visions of tomorrow. And I have in the syllabus an ever-growing list of possible questions that students can base those papers on. And a lot of those questions have come from students themselves who've taken the course, who've just thought very, very creatively about the material and come up with really interesting topics that never would have occurred to me. And topics that that engage more recent stuff, as you say, that I haven't become familiar with yet. So yeah, it's just been enormously helpful. It's wonderful to teach a course similar to the topic that that you're writing on, because you can have a very powerful synergy between the two.
Well, I have not and will not ever teach a course called The History of Vitamin D and Rickets, but I have taught and do taught and love to teach a course based on my next book about moving indoors. And I first taught that at the University of Georgia many years ago, a generation ago. And one of the assignments was to interview your parents about their relationship as children to the outdoors. Now this was Georgia, and the answers I got were pretty much what I expected, except I really got some wonderful stuff about hunting and animal violence, cruelty to animals that I wasn't expecting, but because I didn't think anybody would own up to it, but I know it was an issue that I'm studying. And then I come a generation later and I'm teaching the same course at Brooklyn College. And the two things that happened that are other than that a generation has gone by, so that when they ask their parents lived this transition. They've lived past this transition that I'm talking about. But I said, go ahead and ask your grandparents. But the other thing is, being Brooklyn College, I got an international perspective that I never got at the University of Georgia, and realized I need to be very sensitive to how much of my story is an American story, and how different, and in many ways, a generational shift up for these students who had who asked their parents, and the questions were about what was it like in the old country, and their childhood in the old country was very different. So, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Any other questions that remain? Professor Warren or Rawson, do you have any questions for each other that remain? No pressure, no pressure. Just putting it out there.
Nope, I don't think so.
No, I
What-
just, I get sad that I'm never going to get to teach the class that I wanted to teach. I have a title for it and everything. It's Apocalypse Then, which goes at a lot of these things. But now I can't do it.
Awesome. Well, with
But you
that,
can have the title, Mike.
our next event, just so you all know, is actually in person. It's Friday, March 11th, and we have a former history minor who was also a classics major, who is now a PhD student in classics, coming in person to talk to us about her work on a Byzantine poem about the suffering Christ. So if you're interested in coming and hearing from Julia Perret, sister of Grace Perret, about her current work, you can come join us. And otherwise, we'll see you on Zoom at the end of March with Professor Samia Khatun, who's coming to us from London, who will speak about her monograph on a Tuesday evening. So see you all soon. Professor Johnson actually speaking in the beginning of March, that's out of order on my sheet, about gerrymandering and redistricting in 2022 midterms, right? Lots of fun things to look forward to. So your professors will keep you posted on the events to come. And thank you, Professor Rawson and Professor Warren, for telling us about your books. It was fantastic.
Thank you for hosting, Professor Mancia.
Yes, indeed.
Of course. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. It's supposed to be 60 tomorrow in New York.
That's right.
Enjoy. I know. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, it looks like